Today, we will be exploring 8 caving expeditions that went terribly wrong. From narrow squeezes and sudden floods to eerie discoveries deep underground, each story reveals just how unpredictable and dangerous these adventures can be. So without any further ado, let's get started. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of June 25, 2004, 38-year-old Dan Garrison and his 11-year-old son, Justin, set out for what they thought would be a simple, fun cave adventure. Their destination? Pepper Sauce Cave in Arizona, a twisting limestone maze known for its tricky passages and easy-to-get lost turns. Outside, the summer heat was brutal, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 37 Celsius. So the cool cave felt like a perfect escape. Dan had promised this trip to Justin as a birthday gift, hoping it would be a special memory for them to share. But in his excitement, Dan made 2 dangerous mistakes that would turn this day into a nightmare. First, he forgot to pack extra batteries for their flashlights. And second, he didn't tell anyone, not even his wife, where they were going. These simple oversights would soon put both their lives on the line. Dan, usually a careful man, let his enthusiasm and his past experience in the cave years ago make him overconfident. By around noon, father and son arrived at the entrance of Pepper Sauce Cave, ready for their adventure, completely unaware of the danger waiting inside. They stepped into the mouth of the cave, a dark opening in the rocky hillside that seemed to swallow them whole. The moment they crossed the threshold, the heat of the desert disappeared, replaced by the cool, damp air of the underground world. They flicked on their flashlights, beams cutting through the thick darkness. The passages twisted and turned like a stone maze, sometimes opening into roomy chambers, other times squeezing down so tight they had to crawl on their hands and knees. The jagged rocks scraped at their clothes and skin, but the thrill of exploring kept them moving. Justin eagerly pointed out odd-shaped formations, and Dan explained how, over thousands of years, dripping water had carved these tunnels. After about 2 hours of exploring, they reached a spot known as the Book Room, a chamber named for the logbook left by previous visitors. They scribbled their names inside, marking the date and time, feeling proud of how far they had come. By now, they had passed through countless winding passages and even used a fixed rope left by others to reach this deeper section. The book room felt different, larger, with enough space to stand and move freely. It gave them a brief moment to catch their breath, but they had no idea the real danger was still ahead. As the excitement of their adventure wore off and hunger started creeping in, Dan decided it was time to head back to the entrance. They turned around, expecting to easily retrace their steps. But almost immediately, they faced a troubling realization. The passages all looked the same. What had felt like a straightforward path on the way in now appeared like a confusing maze of twists and turns. Familiar spots looked different, almost as if the cave had shifted around them. The tunnel Dan was sure they had come through now split into 3, and none of them seemed right. They spent the next hour making wrong turns, doubling back, and growing more disoriented. By the time Dan checked his watch, it was already 4 p.m. The cold, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, made them shiver as fatigue set in. They were lost, and no one outside even knew they were here. They ate some snacks to keep up their energy, but it did little against the cold, heavy darkness pressing in around them. Each passage led to another, and each chamber opened into more tunnels, all blending together in the dim light. They had no map, no experience with complex caves, and no clear way to tell which direction led to safety. Dan checked his flashlight. Its beam was already growing weak. With no extra batteries, he knew the darkness would soon become their worst enemy. Inside the book room, they found a notebook and a pen left behind by other explorers. Using the small compass on Dan's wristwatch, they started sketching the paths they took, marking dead ends and noting any unique features they could spot. By 10 p.m., their flashlights were fading fast. Their snacks were gone, and their water was running dangerously low. Their map revealed something unsettling. Many of the tunnels looped back on themselves, making the maze even harder to figure out. As midnight neared, Justin fought to stay awake, his energy fading. Dan found a patch of sandy ground where his son could rest, telling him to lie down while he kept exploring nearby. Justin curled up on the hard floor, using his thin jacket as a pillow. What had once been a cool, comfortable temperature now felt bitterly cold as their body heat drained away into the ground. Dan checked on Justin often, his worry growing as he saw how uncomfortable and vulnerable his son looked in the dark, freezing cave. When they finally had to turn off their dying flashlights to save what little power remained, the darkness became absolute. Dan figured they had been trapped inside the cave for over 12 hours now, and the thought that no one even knew they were missing gnawed at him. Morning had already arrived in the world above, but deep inside Peppersauce Cave, time seemed to stand still. Dan's watch now read 7 a.m. They had been underground for 19 hours. Their situation was becoming critical. Their flashlights were almost out, and thirst clung to them like a shadow. They had only half a bottle of water left. Dan carefully rationed it, giving most of it to Justin and taking just enough for himself to wet his dry, cracked lips. Despite everything, Justin stayed surprisingly calm for an 11-year-old. When he woke up, he told his dad they needed to find water. Dan agreed, though in truth, he had no idea where to even start looking. But then, Justin suggested something smart. Why not listen for the sound of dripping water? Dan was impressed. Even in such a terrifying situation, his son was thinking clearly. With a new goal in mind, they moved carefully through the tunnels, often turning off their flashlights to listen in the darkness. Sure enough, Justin's sharp ears picked up the faint sound of water dripping somewhere deeper in the cave. They followed the sound slowly, feeling their way through tight, unfamiliar passages. The dripping grew louder, giving them hope. Then, Justin's flashlight beam caught something hanging from above, a rope. He froze, then shouted excitedly for his dad. It was the same rope they had used the day before to climb down to the lower level. This was it, the way back up. Justin rushed to get his father, and together they climbed back to the upper level. Once there, Dan spotted a familiar rock formation they had passed on their way in. Using their homemade map and Dan's memory, they carefully made their way through the maze-like passages. This time, they avoided the wrong turns that had trapped them for so long. Finally, after almost 24 hours in the cold, pitch-black depths of Peppersauce Cave, they saw it, a soft, faint glow of daylight up ahead. Finally, they spotted the cave entrance, a small window of blue sky waiting for them. The heat, which had seemed unbearable the day before, now felt like a warm embrace after the freezing darkness of the cave. Dan's car was still parked where they had left it, untouched. There had been no search party, no one out looking for them, because no one even knew they were missing. On March 15, 2004, a team of seasoned explorers prepared to descend into Qualot, a vast cave system in Mexico's rugged Salina region. This group, part of the Combined Services Caving Association, CSCA, they were experienced cavers made up of current and former British Armed Forces members, with years of underground exploration under their belts. Their mission was clear: reach Camp 1, a pre-established base about a kilometer inside the cave, complete survey work, and return. For years, this team had been systematically exploring the cave system, and this expedition was another step in their ongoing efforts. The weather that morning was damp but not concerning. While the region was known for sudden rainfall that could flood the entrance passages, the group was well aware of the risks. They had chosen Camp 1 specifically because it was in a dry, safe section of the cave, beyond the areas prone to flooding. Confident in their plan, they began their descent into the unknown. The team had come prepared, carrying food, radios, and emergency supplies to handle unexpected delays. As they descended into the cave, their focus was sharp, each step measured and deliberate. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the narrow beams of their headlamps. The air was cold and still. and the slick, damp floor made every move cautious. They navigated tight corridors and climbed over jagged rocks, eventually reaching Camp 1 after hours of effort. There, they unpacked their gear and began their planned work with no sense of urgency. They had done this countless times before. By March 17, 2004, the first sign of trouble appeared. Heavy rains had fallen the night before, and when a relief crew tried to enter the cave, they discovered the entrance passage completely flooded. The sump, a dangerous underwater section that formed during extreme weather, had blocked all access. Despite the setback, there was no panic. The team had prepared for such a possibility and remained calm, confident they could wait out the storm. The men had enough food, a dry shelter, and a working communication link to the outside world. At first, waiting seemed like the best option. But by morning, the water hadn't receded. It had risen. What started as a manageable delay was quickly becoming a dangerous ordeal. Updates crackled over the radio. More rain was on the way. The grim reality sank in. They could be stuck for days. The chamber's air grew thick and damp, making it harder to breathe. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, broken by the constant dripping of water echoing off the cave walls. What had once been a familiar darkness now felt oppressive and suffocating. 5 days had passed since the team entered the cave, and the relentless rain outside showed no sign of stopping. Their food supplies were running out quicker than expected, forcing them to ration carefully. Desperation grew as the surface team tried to involve Mexican rescue divers, but none had the specialized training needed for the flooded passages. Their only hope was a team of British divers who had been contacted but hadn't yet arrived. By March 23, 2004, panic began to set in. The air inside the chamber felt heavy and stale, thick with humidity and the unrelenting smell of their unwashed bodies. They were perpetually damp, their clothes clinging to their skin as the cold seeped deep into their bones. Radio updates from the surface team had grown less frequent, offering little more than words of encouragement. The divers were on their way, but the men below knew that if the rains continued, even the best efforts might not be enough. By March 24th, the water levels still hadn't dropped. Now, into their 8th day underground, the group was showing signs of severe physical and mental strain. The cold, damp air chilled them to the bone, and their sluggish movements reflected their waning energy. Sleep was sporadic and restless, broken by the constant need to monitor water levels and the gnawing fear that help might not arrive in time. Above ground, British cave divers Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson had finally arrived. They meticulously reviewed maps, double-checked their equipment, and waited for the perfect moment to begin their risky rescue. The pressure was immense. One misstep could spell disaster, not only for them, but also for the men relying on their skill. By the morning of March 25th, the decision was made to proceed. Stanton and Mallinson entered the water, navigating the narrow, flooded tunnels with precision, their movements guided by the pre-rigged safety line. The rescue had begun. The passage was perilous, with poor visibility and tight spaces that made every movement a potential hazard. Navigating with their equipment was a challenge. One wrong move, a snagged line, a careless kick stirring up silt, or a failed air supply could be catastrophic. After what felt like endless tension, the divers finally reached Camp 1. The 6 trapped cavers greeted them with a mix of overwhelming relief and urgent desperation. Though exhausted, there was no time to rest. The divers handed out extra air tanks and gave clear, precise instructions. Each caver would be guided out one at a time through the flooded tunnel, a process that would take hours. Slowly, one by one, the cavers submerged into the icy water, placing their trust in their rescuers. The return journey was grueling. Visibility was nearly zero, forcing them to rely on touch and memory to navigate. Every second underwater was a battle against rising panic and the instinct to thrash and flee. After 9 painstaking hours, the entire group emerged from the cave's grip and stumbled into the open air. Their relief was short-lived. A storm of camera flashes greeted them, reporters shouting questions, and officials scrutinizing their every move. Though physically unharmed, the emotional toll of their ordeal weighed heavily on them, leaving a mark that no storm of media attention could erase. The team was taken to a military hospital for evaluation, where the weight of the past 8 days began to sink in. They had defied the odds and survived, but the consequences of their ordeal were only starting to unfold. In the days that followed, the situation took a dramatic turn. The Mexican government, under pressure from growing public outrage and intense media scrutiny, detained the entire expedition team. Authorities began questioning their true intentions in the cave. The presence of military personnel among the cavers, along with specialized radon testing equipment, fueled wild accusations. Speculation ranged from secretive geological exploration to espionage. Exhausted and confused, the team suddenly found themselves at the center of an international controversy. The British government quickly stepped in, negotiating for their release amidst mounting tensions between the two countries. Meanwhile, the media ran rampant with theories. Were the cavers spies? Were they illegally mining for resources? Every possible scenario was thrown into the spotlight, intensifying public curiosity and diplomatic strain. After 3 days of relentless questioning, the cavers were formally charged with failing to disclose the scientific purpose of their trip and lacking the necessary research permits. Despite no evidence of wrongdoing, they were expelled from Mexico, banned from returning, and escorted onto a flight back to the United Kingdom under diplomatic watch. Back home, the team faced a different storm. While some praised their survival and courage, others harshly criticized their decision to embark on such a risky expedition. The media frenzy eventually subsided, but the experience left deep scars on all involved. It all began on April 9th, 2005. A 20-year-old named Richard Harness was leading a group of 12 excited children into one of the most dangerous caves in the region, Devil's Den Cave. Tucked beneath the Ozark Mountains, this cave is known for its tricky paths and hidden dangers. Richard had explored the cave before, and that gave him confidence, maybe too much of it. While Richard gave a quick rundown to the kids inside, another instructor, Melissa Jones, waited outside. She was scheduled to guide another group later in the day. The air outside was mild, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 20 degrees Celsius. But deep inside the cave, the temperature dropped to a chilly 55 degrees, or 13 Celsius, cold enough to slowly drain the body's warmth over time. The kids, all between 8 and 12 years old, were full of energy as they put on their helmets and flicked on their flashlights, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. None of the kids had ever been in a wild cave before. Their only experience underground was in safe, commercial show caves, with paved walkways and bright lights guiding the way. This was completely different. Richard brought a small backpack with the basics: water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and some extra batteries. It was a simple 3-hour trip, or so he thought. What Richard didn't consider was how his own body had changed since his last cave visit 6 months earlier. He'd put on about 15 pounds, or 6.8 kilograms, over the winter. By 11:30 that morning, the group had already made their way through a maze of tight, twisting tunnels. The kids, being smaller, had little trouble squeezing through, but Richard had to suck in his breath and twist himself into awkward shapes just to keep up. Every time they made it through a tough spot, it gave them a false sense of confidence, like nothing could go wrong. Then they reached a real challenge, a narrow vertical crack, only about 10 inches wide or 25 centimeters, but stretching upward around 6 feet or 1.8 meters. It connected 2 horizontal tunnels. When Richard aimed his flashlight through the crack, he saw the next space was just big enough for someone like him to crawl through on their hands and knees. In his head, he labeled it the next room, but it was far from safe. Richard thought of it as a room, though in reality it was just a slightly wider stretch of tunnel. Still, He remembered from earlier trips that this section led to even more fascinating parts of the cave. The narrow fissure looked familiar. He was sure he'd squeezed through it before. So, he made a crucial decision. He would have the kids go through first while he stayed back to supervise. Then, he'd follow them into the passage beyond. One by one, the children turned sideways and carefully slid through the gap, their small bodies twisting to fit through the tight stone walls. Some of them let out quiet groans as the cold rock pressed against their ribs and backs, but they all made it through. All 12 kids emerged into the tunnel on the other side, crawling forward on hands and knees. Richard could see their movements through the crack, laughing, shuffling, and completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Then, Richard turned sideways and began squeezing into the narrow crack himself. Right away, the stone felt tighter than he remembered. His chest pressed hard against one wall, his back against the other. Still, he pushed on, sucking in his stomach and inching forward, slowly. But halfway through, he came to a stop. The space had narrowed just slightly. Barely enough to notice, but it was enough to trap him. His hips, just a few centimeters wider than his chest, wouldn't fit. He tried to back out, but the angle had changed, and now he couldn't move backward either. The stone held him like a vice. His chest was compressed, making it harder and harder to breathe. That's when it hit him. Clear as day and absolutely terrifying. He was stuck. Really stuck. And on the other side of the rock, 12 kids were now cut off from help, trapped deeper in the cave. Panic surged through him. His heart pounded against the cold rock, and each breath came in short, shallow gasps. The fear was raw and primal. And then came the crushing truth. This was his fault. He had led them here. Now, his own body was the wall keeping them from safety. On the other side of the narrow crack, the kids' excitement vanished in an instant. Fear took over. Just moments ago, they were full of wonder. Now, their faces were frozen in panic as they realized their guide was stuck. Some of the younger ones didn't move at all, paralyzed by shock. Others began to cry softly, unsure of what to do. A few of the older kids tried to stay calm. They crawled back toward the fissure to check on Richard. Through the narrow gap, they could see him, wedged tightly in the stone, unable to move forward or backward. Seeing the adult they trusted trapped and helpless shattered any sense of safety they had. If Richard couldn't get himself out, who would be able to help them? Above ground, Melissa Jones glanced at her watch. The group wasn't expected back until 3 p.m., still over 3 hours away. She sat comfortably in the spring sunshine, unaware of the growing emergency happening deep below her feet. She looked toward the cave entrance every now and then, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But underground, time had started to blur. The first 30 minutes were a frantic rush of effort. Richard twisted, pushed, and pulled. But every movement only made things worse. The rock held him tighter with each attempt. Richard's hips, now slightly wider than he remembered, had become a solid anchor in the narrowest part of the crack, completely stuck. An hour passed. The panic had started to fade, but something even more dangerous was creeping in: the cold. Inside the cave, the temperature didn't change, and without movement to keep them warm, the kids started to shiver. Even in his trapped and worsening condition, Richard tried to stay calm. He told the children to huddle close together to keep warm. But his own situation was getting worse fast. His legs hung uselessly below him, the pressure cutting off circulation. He began to feel a tingling sensation, the first warning signs of something called compression syndrome. If left too long, it could be deadly. By the time 2 hours had passed, the air itself had started working against them. With 12 children and 1 trapped adult breathing in the small space, oxygen was running low. Carbon dioxide was building up. The first sign came when some of the children complained of headaches. Then came dizziness and nausea. The children's bodies were starting to show warning signs, their systems reacting to the changing air around them. But above ground, Melissa Jones still had no idea of the unfolding crisis. With the group's scheduled return still hours away, there was no reason yet to raise an alarm. By the third hour underground, things had gotten much worse. Some of the kids had gone eerily still. The small water supply they brought, enough for just a short trip, was already halfway gone. Without enough to drink, dehydration began speeding up the effects of the cold. Their body temperatures were dropping faster now. Two of the youngest kids had fallen asleep, no matter how hard the older ones tried to keep them awake. But this wasn't normal sleep. It was a dangerous sign of hypothermia setting in. At 3 p.m., when the group was supposed to return and still no one had emerged from the cave, Melissa finally grew worried. She contacted the park rangers and the search began. When rescuers finally reached the group, the scene was worse than they expected. Richard was still stuck, barely conscious, wedged tightly in the narrow vertical crack. The 12 kids were trapped behind him, no way to reach them or pass them supplies until he was freed. Park rangers and firefighters, lacking proper cave training, tried using sledgehammers and chisels to break away the rock. But every hit sent powerful vibrations through the limestone, threatening to collapse the very space they were trying to open. One ranger even broke his hand from a misjudged swing, proof of how risky and unprepared the rescue attempt was. The Washington County Search and Rescue Team, trained in cave emergencies, finally showed up. After a quick assessment, they realized that if they could lift him just a few inches higher, into a slightly wider part of the fissure, he might be able to squeeze through. They used strong nylon straps, called tubular webbing, commonly used in climbing and rescue work, to create slings that could be slid under Richard's arms. With precision and teamwork, they gently pulled him upward. At the same time, they cut away his jeans to remove any extra bulk holding him back. After being trapped in solid rock for 5 long hours, Richard was finally freed. But freedom came at a painful cost. As blood rushed back into the parts of his body that had been compressed for so long, he felt sharp, stabbing pain, like 1,000 needles hitting all at once. As Richard was carried toward the surface, rescuers immediately turned their attention to the children. One by one, they assessed each child's condition and began guiding them back through the narrow passage, starting with those who needed help the most. Outside, medics were waiting. They treated the kids for hypothermia right away. 2 of the youngest, in the worst shape, were rushed straight to the hospital. Though clearly shaken by what they'd been through, the children responded well to the treatment. All 12 were eventually taken to the local hospital to be fully checked over. And thankfully, doctors confirmed that none had suffered lasting physical harm. Richard, though able to walk out under his own strength, thanks mostly to adrenaline, wasn't so lucky. Compression syndrome, hypothermia, dehydration, and low oxygen levels nearly cost 13 lives that day. It all began on the morning of October 7th, 2001, a crisp autumn Sunday in upstate New York. Gage Caverns, a well-known limestone cave system near Schoharie, had long been a favorite spot for explorers eager to experience its hidden beauty. That day, 5 friends, Edward Galby, Kevin Shaw, Shio Kudo, Adam Dobson, and J.J. Bradingham, arrived at the cave around 10:30 a.m. They were a mix of seasoned cavers and excited newcomers, all looking forward to the thrill of venturing underground. Gage Caverns was famous among local adventurers, with its winding dry tunnels and water-filled passages carved out by underground streams over thousands of years. Before stepping inside, they double-checked their gear. The October air outside was cold, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But they knew once they were underground, the cave would hold steady at around 52 degrees, no matter the season. Around 11 that morning, they entered through the main opening, a gaping black hole in the hillside that seemed to swallow the daylight whole. The first chamber was wide and tall, giving them room to gather and adjust. But as they pushed deeper into the cave, the passages quickly grew tighter and more confined. The group chose to start their journey by exploring the dry side of the cave. This route included a tricky stretch known as the balls down crawl, named for the uncomfortable method required to get through, lying flat on your stomach and inching forward along the cold, rough ground. For the first couple of hours, everything went smoothly. They snapped photos, admired strange rock formations, and shared moments of excitement as they moved deeper into the cave. By around 1 p.m., they made their way back to a larger chamber known as the amphitheater, a roomy space where several tunnels meet. It was the perfect spot to take a break, have some snacks, and plan their next move. The amphitheater was about the size of a small classroom, with a ceiling high enough for them to stand without crouching. Around them, several small, shadowy openings branched off into darkness, some barely more than cracks in the rock. One of these caught the eye of Shio Kudo, a 28-year-old graduate student who was still fairly new to caving. She was especially curious about a narrow horizontal crack that looked like it might lead to a hidden chamber beyond. The crack looked just wide enough, about 2 feet across and only 18 inches high. It seemed like someone might be able to squeeze through if they lay on their side. Since Kudo was the smallest in the group, she offered to check it out. Her friends watched as she carefully lay down and started sliding into the narrow space. But trouble started almost right away. What looked like a straight tunnel from the outside quickly turned into something much more dangerous. Just a few feet in, the passage suddenly bent sharply to the right, at a 90-degree angle that wasn't visible from where the others stood. Kudo had to twist her body awkwardly to follow the bend. She managed to get her upper body around the corner, but her legs remained stretched out behind her in the original direction, forcing her into a painful, twisted position. Things got worse fast. The crack narrowed even more just past the bend, closing in right where her ribs pressed against the jagged rock. Kudo quickly realized she was stuck. She couldn't move forward or backward. The rough limestone dug into her sides, and the tight space squeezed her chest, making it hard to breathe. She called out to her friends, trying to stay calm even though fear was creeping in. Kevin Shaw and Edward Galby rushed over, trying everything they could think of. They coached her to adjust her position, pulled gently on her feet, even tried pushing from her shoulders, but nothing worked. The sharp bend had turned into a cruel trap, catching her in a position that was nearly impossible to escape. After several failed attempts to free her, the group realized they needed outside help. And while the cave stayed at a steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit, that temperature now posed another risk. Stuck and unable to move, Kudo's body could start to lose heat dangerously fast, putting her at risk of hypothermia. Shaw quickly volunteered to go for help, while the others stayed behind with Kudo, doing their best to keep her calm and watch over her. Shaw made his way through the winding cave as fast as he could. Without wasting a second, he called emergency services, carefully explaining the situation and giving details about where Kudo was trapped inside the cave. Rescue teams were soon alerted, including experienced cave rescue units and emergency medical crews trained to handle these kinds of situations. Meanwhile, deep inside the dark amphitheater, Kudo's condition was getting worse by the minute. The pressure on her ribs made every breath a struggle. Her arm and hip were going numb from the hard, cold rock pressing into her side. But perhaps the hardest part was the mental strain, the crushing darkness, the claustrophobic space, and the creeping fear that she might not get out. Around 2:15 p.m., the first rescuers arrived at the cave entrance. They quickly split into teams and made their way toward the amphitheater, where Kudo was still trapped and struggling. By 3 p.m., the first rescue team reached her side. A paramedic immediately checked her vital signs. At that point, Kudo had been stuck for almost 2 hours, and the toll it was taking on her body and her mind was becoming clear. The rescue team tried the same methods her friends had already attempted, pulling from different angles, using lubricants to ease the friction, and gently rocking her body to see if they could free her. But the position she was stuck in, her torso twisted at an extreme angle, with her ribs crushed against the narrowing rock, made all these techniques useless. By 5 p.m., Kudo had been trapped for nearly 4 hours, and everyone could see her condition was worsening. The pain in her ribs had become excruciating, and the cold was draining her energy fast. Finally, around 7:20 p.m., 2 veteran cave rescuers, Joe Armstrong and Ken Fortin, made it to the scene. They brought specialized tools, including small drills and chisels made for breaking rock in tight spaces. After assessing the situation, they knew the hard truth. There was only one way to free Kudo now. They would have to carefully chip away at the rock that held her in place. It would be a slow, delicate, and risky process, but it was the only hope she had. Armstrong and Fortin had to work carefully in the cramped, claustrophobic space. Every move they made had to be precise. They couldn't risk dislodging more rock or creating dust that might make it even harder for Kudo to breathe. Through it all, Kudo stayed awake, but her body was wearing down. She had now been trapped in that brutal position for nearly 8 hours. Her body twisted sideways, her ribs crushed, and every breath a struggle. Then, finally, just after 9 p.m., Armstrong and Fortin cleared enough rock that they could slowly and carefully ease her out. The pain as her blood rushed back into her numb, compressed body was overwhelming. Medics were ready. They wrapped her in warming blankets and immediately began treating her for hypothermia and compression injuries. Her ribs were badly bruised, and parts of her side were still numb from the hours of pressure. Instead of rushing her straight out of the cave, rescuers gave Kudo time to rest and regain her strength. They offered her warm fluids and kept a close eye on her condition. Only when she was ready did they begin the slow, careful journey back through the cave's twisting passages, helping her every step of the way. Finally, at 10:20 p.m., almost 9.5 hours after she first became stuck, Shu Kudo emerged from Gage Caverns into the cold night air. Paramedics were waiting to take her to the hospital for further care. Amazingly, after everything she'd been through, she suffered no permanent injuries, just severe bruising, temporary nerve damage, and, of course, the lasting emotional scars of her terrifying ordeal. Later, local caving experts like Tom Engel reflected on the incident, pointing out that in the early hours of the rescue, there had been confusion over exactly how long Kudo had been trapped. This may have delayed the response. Engel stressed an important lesson for all cavers. If someone is stuck and can't be freed within 15 minutes, it's critical to call for help immediately. Bear Hollow Rift wasn't your average cave. This place was brutal. Imagine squeezing through tunnels so tight they crush your ribs, climbing down bottomless pits, and scaling slick vertical walls. That's what 8 experienced cavers, including Andy Zellner, Jim Smith, Bill Steele, and Jay Jordan, signed up for on November 25, 2006. They thought they were ready. They were wrong. After fighting their way down 3 massive drops and through tunnels that scraped skin off their bones, the team reached the bottom completely drained. Every muscle screamed in protest. But Jordan had it even tougher. His bulky wetsuit and oversized pack turned every move into a struggle. The others waited patiently each time he fell behind. In this cave, you couldn't rush things. One wrong move could be your last. At the bottom of the cave, the team faced a tough choice. 4 members decided to begin the exhausting climb back to daylight, their bodies already pushed to the limit. They turned to Jordan. "Come with us," they urged. But Jordan shook his head. That single decision would soon become his biggest regret. Later, hoping to beat the worst of the fatigue, Jordan set out alone ahead of the remaining 3 cavers. Every movement was agony as he dragged himself through the dripping, claustrophobic tunnels, his energy fading fast. When Zellner, Smith, and Steele finally followed his path, they discovered their worst nightmare come true. There, at the most dangerous spot imaginable, the 45-foot vertical pit, Jordan was completely trapped. He'd somehow managed to climb the rope, but now hung helpless at the top, his body wedged against the unforgiving rock. The narrow tunnel beyond might as well have been miles away. He couldn't move forward, couldn't go back, and with every passing second, his situation grew more desperate. The real issue was something called the rock horn, a sharp, unforgiving chunk of stone that jutted out near the top of the pit like a barrier. It was fixed in place, immovable, and it made the already narrow crawlway above nearly impossible to enter. Jordan had done the hard part. He'd climbed the full 45-foot rope, soaked and exhausted. But now, just a few feet from safety, he found himself completely stuck. The tight space, already difficult to navigate, was made worse by his wetsuit and gear. He tried everything, twisting, turning, pulling, but nothing worked. He was wedged in, completely trapped. Below, Zellner, Smith, and Steele watched, their hearts sinking as they realized how bad the situation was. They offered suggestions, called out tips, tried to help guide him through, but nothing made a difference. The setup he was using, a climbing system called the rope walker, just wasn't designed for this kind of tight maneuvering. It held him in place too rigidly, preventing him from getting the flexibility he needed to pull himself over the lip and into the passage. And the more he struggled, the more drained he became. For Jordan, switching to the Texas system didn't make a difference. The rock horn still blocked his upper body, and he was simply too exhausted to make the moves he needed. The only option left was to get rid of the obstacle. He stood on the etrier, stretching his body as far as he could, fighting to push past the rock. But it wouldn't budge. Minutes dragged into hours. His strength was fading fast. His breathing turned shallow, his arms trembled, and his legs burned from holding himself in place. And then, he just couldn't do it anymore. His grip slipped. His body gave out, and he slid back down the 45-foot shaft. It wasn't a free fall, but it was the fall of someone who had nothing left to give. When he hit the bottom, he didn't move. The others rushed to him, afraid of what they'd find. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt, but he was done. His arms lay limp, his chest rose and fell with deep, tired breaths. The three rescuers quickly made a decision. They turned and climbed out of the cave, pushing through the same brutal crawls and pit climbs that had nearly broken Jordan. They had to get supplies, warm clothes, food, and water. Jordan sat alone in the darkness, shivering, his body worn down from cold, hunger, and pure exhaustion. Hours passed like days. When Smith and Steele finally made it back to him, they brought dry clothes, a warm jacket, and something to eat. By 4:15 in the morning, rescue teams were called in. These weren't ordinary first responders. They were trained cave rescuers, equipped with specialized tools, hammer drills, bolt kits, rock shavers, everything needed to work in the tightest, most dangerous spots underground. At 8:50 a.m., they entered the cave and began the long descent into the narrow, winding passages. Their goal was to reach Jordan and get him out safely. By the time they arrived, he'd been trapped for over 20 hours. He wasn't bleeding, he hadn't broken any bones. But you could see the toll it had taken. His eyes were hollow, his body barely moving, his energy gone. There was no other choice. The rescuers got to work, drilling into the rock horn that had trapped Jordan for so long. Each hit of the hammer echoed through the cave, deep and powerful, like distant thunder rolling through the earth. Jordan could only watch, his body shivering uncontrollably from the cold, his mind barely holding on. He had never felt this powerless in his life. To give him a better chance of escaping, the team set a new anchor bolt at a better angle, hoping it would make the transition easier. Then finally, the last pieces of rock gave way, cracking and breaking like the final bars of a prison cell. It was time. Jordan moved for the first time in hours. His hands gripped the rope, shaking violently. His legs felt numb, refusing to respond. And then, he was out. The team grabbed him, catching him as he collapsed onto the cave floor. He was free, but barely holding on. The climb to the surface was a blur. Jordan didn't have the strength to do it on his own, but the rescuers stayed by his side the entire way. His mind drifted, fading in and out, his body running purely on survival instinct. Then, at last, he saw it, the mouth of the cave. And when the cold morning air hit his face, it felt unreal. After 24 grueling hours trapped in the dark, Jordan was finally free. High in Mexico's Oaxaca mountains, at 2,700 meters above sea level, the gaping mouth of Qualot Cave beckons only the bravest explorers. This isn't your average hole in the ground. It's one of Earth's deepest cave systems, a vertical labyrinth that has challenged American caving teams for decades. The air at Chave's entrance is thinner than Denver's, making every physical effort twice as exhausting. In February 1991, 14 elite cavers assembled at base camp, their sights set on an audacious goal: to dive past the cave's known limits. But first came the grueling prep work, carefully rigging 35 vertical drops between the surface and Camp 2, a temporary home 850 meters down. That's deeper than 2 Empire State Buildings stacked underground. This wasn't simple rappelling. To protect their ropes from sharp limestone walls, they used a rebelay system. Imagine climbing down a series of suspended rope segments, having to stop every few meters to switch your gear. One wrong move mid-transfer, and you're falling into darkness. On February 25th, the first team of 6 began their descent. 7 to 10 hours of squeezing through cracks, rappelling into voids, and navigating waterfalls, all while hauling gear. Over subsequent days, teams played underground relay, shuttling supplies deeper into Chave's mysterious depths. Each trip was a ballet of skill and endurance, where concentration meant the difference between discovery and disaster. On March 1st, the team returned. Peter Bostad, Peter Haberland, and 2 others. James Brown, still nursing a hurt shoulder, and Chris Jorger, who'd been feeling under the weather. They entered in shifts an hour apart to avoid traffic jams in the narrow tunnels. This staggered entry technique is called leapfrogging, just like the playground game. Jorger and Haberland made good progress. By mid-afternoon, they hit Sacknoom's Well, a series of slippery vertical drops. Here, Jorger fumbled his rappel rack, the crucial device that controls your descent speed, and had to borrow Haberland's to recover it. At the time, it seemed like just a small mistake. By evening, they'd left the wet sections behind, entering dry chambers near Camp 2. At flag junctions, the identical-looking rock walls confused them briefly before they found their way. The last challenge? East Gorge, a tight canyon with a tricky 2-part drop. Haberland explained. First, a 10-meter slide down loose rocks, then a heart-stopping 23-meter freefall. The rebelay, a mid-rope anchor point, was vital here. Without it, the rope would rub against sharp rocks and quickly fray. One weak spot could mean disaster. Haberland went first, carefully working through the tricky rope setup. The safety anchor was awkwardly placed, way too low, so he had to use his foot ascender to get enough slack to unhook safely. Once down, he yelled up, "All clear." Then, Jorger's warning echoed down. Haberland froze, waiting to hear "off rope." What came instead made his stomach drop. A whooshing sound, then a bone-chilling thud. Silence. Jorger. Jorger. No answer. Hands shaking, Haberland climbed over his protective boulder and looked down. There was Jorger, completely still in a shallow puddle. His right leg bent all wrong, foot twisted sideways, helmet knocked back but still on his head, arms stretched out like he'd tried to catch himself. Heavy backpack pinning him face down. The water wasn't even deep, maybe 3 inches, but it was enough to drown in if you couldn't move. Haberland's hands shook as he rushed forward. Gently, he turned Jorger's head to keep his face above the shallow water. Knowing spinal injuries could be deadly, he didn't dare move him more. The cave's silence was deafening. No breathing, no movement. No time to check for a pulse. Pure instinct took over. Run. Get help. Now. Whistle shrieking, he flew through passages that had taken hours to navigate, reaching Camp 2 in just 15 minutes. Bostad and Brown jumped up at the alarm. They didn't need words to understand. Grabbing medical supplies and warm gear, they raced back. Jorger hadn't moved. A thin line of blood ran from his nose against ghostly pale skin. Bosted's fingers searched for a pulse. Nothing. The cave's chill bit deeper as they lifted Jorger from the water, wrapping him in a sleeping bag on a rocky shelf. They tried CPR, but each artificial breath just made wet, hollow sounds. After 20 minutes, his face began swelling unnaturally. A flashlight check showed no pupil response. The terrible truth was undeniable. Their friend was gone. The team sat for hours in their headlamp circles. The cave's playful mystery now feeling cold and cruel. After painful discussions, they made the call to bury Jorger right there in Cheve's depths. In a quiet chamber above the fatal drop, his father and friends traveled from the States to say goodbye underground. But grief doesn't follow neat plans. Months passed. The family changed their minds. A special recovery team went back nearly a year later, finally bringing Jorger home. The accident investigation revealed haunting details. Jorger's rappel rack still dangled 2 meters below the Rebele anchor. His safety carabiner hung open like a broken promise. The cave kept its secrets, but the equipment told its own story. Haberlin's reconstruction revealed a terrifying flaw. An unweighted rappel rack could twist just right to pop open the carabiner's gate. The moment Jorger leaned into it, instant freefall. No warning, no time to scream. Modern cavers now use double-lock carabiners after this accident. 2 separate mechanisms to prevent accidental openings. The tragedy sparked urgent safety reforms. Rappel devices must now use unopenable quick links or dual carabiners. Packs should hang below climbers, not weigh down their backs. The Rebele setup was clearly flawed. Too difficult to navigate safely. But here's the hard truth. Disasters never happen for just one reason. It's always a domino effect. A badly placed anchor here, a distracted moment there, an unlocked carabiner. In Cheve's depths, all these small mistakes added up to the unthinkable. Yet, cavers still return to Cheve, pulled by its siren call of undiscovered passages. It remains a place of breathtaking wonder and deadly consequence. Where one wrong move can change everything, the cave doesn't forgive, it doesn't forget, and it's always waiting. Nickajack Dam, built by the Tennessee Valley Authority, is one of the many hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee River. The dam holds back the waters of Nickajack Lake, which stretches along 215 miles of shoreline, winding through the scenic Tennessee River Gorge. Near this dam lies Nickajack Cave, also known locally as Bat Cave, because of the thousands of bats that once called it home. This cave, situated about a mile east of the dam, is just one of the many caves found in Tennessee. But Nickajack Cave, with its dark history and legends, is perhaps one of the most intriguing. The cave has been drawing people for over a century. By 1872, it was already being shown to curious tourists who were taken inside by guides on boats. One of the most famous stories associated with the cave is about Lawrence Ashley, a guide who, in 1927, allegedly disappeared during an exploration. Newspapers like the New York Times reported that he had been lost for a week before reappearing, claiming to have dug his way out 8 miles away. It was later discovered that this was all a hoax meant to attract more visitors to the cave. Over time, the cave became famous for another reason: musician Johnny Cash. In 1967, during a personal crisis, Cash entered the cave with the intention of ending his life. But instead, he had a spiritual experience there, which led him to turn his life around and kick his drug addiction. In 1980, TVA closed the cave, declaring it a sanctuary for thousands of endangered Indiana bats. They installed fences and warning signs, making it clear that entering the cave was illegal. However, despite the warnings, many adventurers and divers still found the cave irresistible, willing to risk fines and even their lives to explore its depths. And as any experienced cave diver will tell you, caves, especially underwater ones, can be treacherous. There are 2 golden rules: never dive into a cave without the proper training and equipment, and always use a guideline to ensure you can find your way back out. David was a 31-year-old from Alabama who loved the outdoors. Whether it was hiking or fishing, he was always seeking adventure. He'd recently taken up scuba diving, fascinated by the world beneath the water. As someone who constantly sought new challenges, David wasn't content with just casual diving. He wanted to push the limits. So, when a friend mentioned the legend of Qualot Cave and its supposedly giant catfish, David was hooked. According to local lore, these massive catfish were thought to thrive on the droppings of the cave's bat population. The thought of catching one was too tempting for David to resist. The only problem? The cave was off limits, surrounded by fences and guarded by heavy penalties for trespassers. David's friend warned him about the dangers of the cave, explaining that it was more than just a fine. People could lose their lives in the unpredictable, murky waters. But for David, the danger was part of the appeal. He'd visited the cave 3 times with his friend, each time pushing a little deeper into the forbidden area. And now he was determined to go even further, hoping to catch the legendary catfish. This would be his final trip, the ultimate challenge. On the night of August 15th, 1992, David and his friend arrived at the cave once again. This time, they had a clear plan: enter the water near the cave and try to spear one of the giant fish they believed was lurking within. The previous night, David had nearly caught a massive catfish, but lost it at the last moment. This time, he was confident they would succeed. They slipped into the murky water just outside the fenced area, their dive lights barely penetrating the darkness. Inside the cave, the water was clearer, but still dangerous. The 2 divers navigated through the narrow passages, following their bubbles to stay oriented. However, as they ventured deeper into the cave, David began to feel uneasy. He checked his air gauge and realized it was running low. It was time to leave. David signaled to his friend that they should head back. But as they tried to ascend, they hit something unexpected, a solid ceiling of rock. They were trapped. Panic set in. They had swum too far into the cave and now found themselves in a maze of flooded passages with no clear way out. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around them as their dive fins stirred up silt from the cave floor, turning the water into a thick fog. Visibility dropped to 0. Desperate, they tried to find their way out, but in the confusion, they got separated. David's friend managed to swim in the right direction and find an exit. But David wasn't so lucky. He surfaced in a small air pocket, alone in the darkness, with no idea how to escape. As soon as David's friend emerged from the cave, he rushed to find help. He contacted the TVA security team, and soon a massive rescue operation was underway. But it wasn't a rescue mission, it was a recovery. The authorities assumed that David had either drowned or succumbed to hypoxia, lack of oxygen, if he'd been lucky enough to find an air pocket. No one believed he could still be alive after so many hours in the cave. The dive teams that arrived were skilled in open water rescues, but they weren't experienced cave divers. Cave diving is a specialized skill that requires years of training, and without proper equipment and knowledge, it's incredibly dangerous. The lead dive team declared that David's situation was hopeless, until Buddy Lane got involved. Buddy Lane, a cave rescue expert from Chattanooga, had been caving since he was 15 years old. He'd participated in his first cave rescue in 1973 and had been hooked ever since. When he heard about the situation at Qualot Cave, Buddy knew he had to act. He believed that David might still be alive in an air pocket deep within the cave, but his offer to help was initially refused. The rescue teams didn't want to risk sending anyone else into the deadly cave. But as time went on and the search yielded no results, the authorities finally agreed to let Buddy and his team take over. Buddy and his team quickly devised a plan. They convinced the TVA to open the floodgates at Quach Dam, lowering the water level in the lake by 14 inches. This would hopefully expose new air pockets in the cave and give David a better chance of survival. Buddy and his lieutenant, Dennis Curry, entered the cave, navigating the dangerous passages with the expertise only a seasoned cave diver could have. They screamed David's name as they swam deeper into the cave, hoping for any sign of life. And then they heard it. A faint "hey" echoed from further inside the cave. David was alive. They followed his voice and found him barely conscious in a tiny air pocket. He had been treading water for 17 hours, fighting off hypoxia as the oxygen in the air pocket slowly ran out. Buddy and Dennis guided David out of the cave, carefully maneuvering through the narrow passages. When they finally emerged into the daylight, the crowd that had gathered along the riverbank erupted in cheers. Against all odds, David had survived his terrifying ordeal. David would later say that he had seen visions while trapped in the cave. Visions of his family, of rescuers searching in vain, and of angels coming to take him home. But it wasn't angels who saved him that day. It was the expertise and determination of Buddy Lane and his team. Cecilio Lopez Tercero's life revolves around pushing boundaries, and he possesses a natural talent for navigating confined spaces. As a child in Spain, Cecilio found his passion for caving, which became more than a pastime. It turned into his purpose. During his youth as an explorer, he showed no fear gliding through caves and tunnels with grace, amazing his companions. He could find his way through a cave's cramped areas, almost as if he had a sixth sense, discovering paths and concealed parts with remarkable precision. His friends saw Cecilio as a true expert in his field, charting the bends and curves of caves, where most people would feel trapped by darkness and stone. Cecilio's abilities only got better as time passed. He possessed a remarkable memory, capable of recording each cave's layout and dangers, and his drive to uncover unexplored regions kept drawing him back to the unknown. It wasn't just about the excitement, though. To Cecilio, every cave might hold hidden treasures, a spot where ancient artifacts and archaeological marvels could remain untouched for hundreds of years. His commitment was one of a kind. He aimed to go where nobody else had been brave enough to explore and make discoveries that could change history books. His dedication made him famous among Spanish cavers, especially due to his 15-year stint with the Madrid Rescue Group, where he helped with tough cave rescues across Europe. Throughout his career, Cecilio ventured into some of the most difficult cave systems in Mexico, Italy, and Uzbekistan. Yet, Peru held a special place in his heart. Peru's rugged, ancient lands hide many undiscovered caves, some untouched for thousands of years, offering chances for groundbreaking archaeological finds. Cecilio dreamed of exploring these depths and uncovering their secrets. This dream seemed within reach when a friend told him about the Imtimache cave in northern Peru. His friend, who had researched the area, called it El Inti-Machay, meaning Cave of the Sun in Quechua. The more Cecilio learned, the more it pulled him in. The cave was enormous, stretching deep underground, and notoriously hard to navigate, full of narrow passages and steep drops. But what really grabbed Cecilio's attention was its potential. Archaeologists believed it might hold important artifacts or even burial sites from ancient civilizations. Cecilio jumped at the chance to map the Imtimache cave. He quickly started planning the expedition back home. This wasn't just another adventure, it was the ultimate test he'd been waiting for. He gathered a small team of top explorers ready to face the cave's unique risks. The Imtimache cave was no walk in the park. It stretched over 1.5 miles long and plunged deeper than 1,200 feet. Inside, the air stayed frigid, rarely warming above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity clinging at nearly 100%. Tight passages, pitch-black darkness, and hidden drops made this cave deadly for the unprepared. The team met with Javier Farge, the landowner who first found the cave, before setting out. Javier acted as both friend and guide, explaining the cave's dangers and possible historical value. He also gave a stark warning: any injury deep in the cave could be fatal due to its remoteness and rescue difficulties. But Javier's words didn't scare the team. They felt ready for anything. In August 2013, Cecilio's team started their first expedition. They focused on checking out already mapped areas and getting a feel for the cave's layout. They spotted hints of ancient remains, but didn't take anything back. By the end, they knew they'd only scratched the surface. Back in Spain, they carefully planned a second trip, this time bringing in experts from Italy and France. Cecilio even got backing from Peru's Lambamba Museum and the Melki Center, which works to protect Peru's historical sites. With permits in hand, they now had access to parts of the cave, usually off-limits, due to its sacred status among local communities. Fast forward to September 8, 2014. Cecilio's team arrived at the Imtimache Cave after a tough 20-hour drive from Lima. They set up camp near the entrance, buzzing with excitement about possible groundbreaking discoveries. For the next 10 days, they dove deeper into the cave, tackling more challenging sections each day. On September 18th, their last day, the team geared up for one final push into unexplored depths, hoping for a big discovery. The air crackled with anticipation as they prepared their gear. Headlamps checked, ropes secured, and communication devices tested. Everything had to be perfect. Cecilio led the way, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and caution. As they descended further than ever before, the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. The team moved carefully, aware that each step could lead to a new find or a dangerous situation. Little did they know, this final dive would test their skills and courage like never before, pushing them to the very limits of human endurance and exploration. Cecilio led the team into the cave's deepest section, carefully anchoring their ropes. The stakes were high. Suddenly, while moving down a narrow shaft, Cecilio's anchor gave way. He plummeted 15 feet, slamming into the rocky floor. Pain shot through his body as he lay there, stunned. He'd broken ribs and damaged his spine. The chilling truth hit him. He was trapped. A teammate reached Cecilio, but the situation looked grim. Cecilio couldn't move, and help was far away. One teammate started the long climb to the surface to alert authorities, while the other stayed with Cecilio, offering support in the dark, cramped space. For 5 days, Cecilio lay still in agony, staring at the rock above. Finally, a Peruvian medical team arrived with morphine to ease his pain, but getting him out remained a huge challenge. News of Cecilio's predicament spread fast. His teammates desperately sought help, even asking the Spanish government to step in. At first, Spain hesitated, but as social media picked up the story, pressure grew. 10 of Cecilio's fellow cavers flew to Peru, determined to save their friend. Soon, volunteers poured in from Spain and other countries, all eager to help. The rescue effort was unlike any before. Experts from many countries joined forces with Peruvian authorities to plan a complex extraction. The remote location and dangerous conditions caused major problems. Food, gear, and even water were scarce and hard to get to the cave. For the next 12 days, rescuers set up a rope and pulley system to get Cecilio out. They installed anchors and built a base camp 900 feet inside the cave. The team battled rain, high altitude, and constant risk of rock slides as they prepared for the extraction. After more than 2 weeks trapped and immobile, Cecilio was finally lifted out on a special stretcher. A helicopter whisked him to a nearby medical center to start his long recovery. The rescue gripped the world's attention. It showcased the power of human determination and teamwork in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Cecilio's ordeal highlighted the risks cave explorers face and the incredible skill and bravery of rescue teams. His survival against all odds inspired many and reminded everyone of the indomitable human spirit. The Imtimache Cave, once a place of excitement and discovery, had become a battleground where life and death hung in the balance. But in the end, human resilience and the unwavering support of the caving community prevailed, bringing Cecilio back from the brink of disaster. Cecilio bounced back months later, his body scarred but his spirit unbroken. He'd faced death in one of Earth's most treacherous caves and lived to tell the tale. The experience changed him forever, yet his passion for exploration burns bright. He dreams of returning to the field, eager to answer the cave's siren call once more.